Thank you so much for joining today. So this webinar forms part of a project that we're running at the Institution of Environmental Sciences that's called Turning the Tide, Systems Thinking for a Sustainable Ocean. I will drop some links into the chat in a minute just to keep everyone in the loop about the project that doesn't already know about it. So today's event is called Tides of Change, Exploring the Resilience and Restoration of the Thames Estuary. We're really pleased to be joined by two speakers today. We have Wanda Bodnar and Amy Pryor from the Thames Estuary Partnership. So they're going to be delivering a presentation that will last for around an hour on the past, the present and the future of the Thames Estuary. After their presentation, there will be a chance for questions from the audience. So please do submit these into the Q&A function in Zoom throughout the session. I'll be kind of moderating that and then asking them on your behalf at the end. And I would also encourage everyone to make full use of the chat throughout today's session. So please do share any thoughts, questions for each other in the chat as well. So yeah, just a reminder that the poll's going. So if everyone has a chance to answer that, we've got a question that's looking to understand the first word that pops into your head when you think of the Thames. So really keen to get people's thoughts on that now before we go forward with the session. So yeah, on that note, thank you so much for joining everyone, and I will now hand over to Wanda.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. So just to provide an overview, I will discuss what we mean by the Thames Estuary and explain things like the tides and the tidal movement and the salinity. This will have relevance to the past of the Thames when I discuss the reasons behind the series of decline and recovery that occurred in the past. And then I will move on to the present, where I will talk specifically about the habitats and the fauna. And lastly, we'll talk about the future, specifically the Tideway tunnel, the climate emergency. And in this context, my colleague Amy will talk about the joint Thames strategies. So starting with what we mean by the Thames Estuary. So first of all, we should distinguish between the River Thames, which is a 345-kilometer long river rising from a series of springs in the Cotswolds and flows into the North Sea, and the tidal Thames, or the Thames Estuary, which is part of the river that is under the influence of the tide. The tidal limit of the estuary is at Teddington, where there is a complex of three locks and a weir that was built for water management purposes in 1810. And of course, because of this connection to the sea, the Thames Estuary has 2 high tides and 2 low tides in a day, and this is why London is actually regarded as a coastal city. Apart from these daily changes of the tidal movement, there are also the monthly tidal cycles. These are the spring and the neap tides, when the height of the tide will vary depending on the alignment of the moon, the sun, and the earth. And the tidal range of the Thames Estuary today is about 7 meters. In terms of salinity, the Thames is a well-mixed estuary with salinity gradually increasing towards the sea. However, on average, we can distinguish between freshwater, brackish, and also salty areas. In addition to these gravitational forces that govern the tides, we also have to account for the 100-meter height difference between the source of the Thames and where it meets the sea. And of course, there are all those larger and smaller rivers that flow into the Thames. So the Thames is the main river that collects other rivers within this area, and this is what we call as the Thames River Basin. And because of its topography, and as well as because of the tributaries, on average, the outgoing ebb tide is slightly longer than the incoming flood tide. So for example, if we were to drop an object somewhere in central London, it would take about 3 months to reach the North Sea. And also because it is a river basin where there are a series of rivers flowing downstream, carrying matter like mudstone, chalk, clay, silt, sand, and gravel. The Thames is a brown river. So all that brown color is because of the resuspended and mixed mud that gets carried around by the tide. And in fact, the Thames would have been brown already when the Romans arrived, as they referred to it as Flumen Thamesis, or dark river. So stepping back in time and to give a bit of background to what led to the first deterioration of the Thames. So as London grew over the centuries and the city was built, open street sewers were constructed. And the primary function of these was to lead rainwater away from the streets of London and to prevent flooding. And also before the invention of the toilet, human waste was actually stored in cesspools that were emptied by the nightmen, and the content was then carried to agricultural fields. However, by the 1800s, with the start of the Industrial Revolution, factories and gasworks appeared along the Thames, and these would release their byproducts into the estuary. And as the population grew, the cesspools, and later when the toilet was invented in 1810, these had to be connected to these existing open sewers, which over time were of course covered up. And so human waste would also enter the Thames. And up until 1831, the old London Bridge made matters slightly worse when it came to pollution, because it had 19 arches and very thick bridge footings, which actually slowed down the flow of the river. And the summer of 1858 was a turning point. Then there was an extended drought, which meant that there was very little freshwater flow coming down from upstream. So if you remember back to that map that I showed earlier. And basically there was a layer of waste, of industrial waste and human waste that accumulated onto the foreshore. And this at places was up to 6 feet deep. And because of the drought, this was also slowly baked by the sun. And this was what the press quickly began to call as the Great Stink of London. Interestingly, there were a number of ideas how to deal with the pollution. One of those was to dig a canal from London down to Portsmouth and to cover the Thames from Battersea to London Bridge. Eventually, though, decision makers settled on the idea to construct a new sewer system, for which Sir Joseph Bazalgette was commissioned to lead. And here the idea was that a series of intercepting pipes would be built so that the sewage would be diverted away from the central London section of the Thames, and it would be released in the east with the outgoing tide. And these intercepting pipes would be connected to those existing sewers so that the rain would dilute this sewage. The construction took place from 1859 to 1865. And in the process, the embankments were built to encase and conceal these intercepting pipes. This meant that the river was significantly narrowed down, and with that the flow and the tidal range also increased. One of the most visible examples of this encroachment is at the near present-day embankment station, where the steps of York Watergate is about 100 meters away from the Thames. However, this building up of the foreshore was not the first, as you can see on this cross-section of the now Upper and Lower Thames Street. So today the Thames is actually about a third of its original width. Nevertheless, the Bazoojet sewer system brought a temporary relief, especially that it was designed for the usage of 4 million people, when at the time the population of London was at 2 million. By the early 20th century, the city started to grow and also started to expand. And so pollution from the tributaries and also from the smaller sewage treatment works started to enter the Thames. And because of that river morphology change, and because when they constructed the embankment, the pollution would actually slightly flow back towards the central section of London as well with the incoming tide. So just think of that back and forth motion that I was talking about earlier. Then during the Blitz, large parts of the sewer system was damaged. The riverside areas were especially targeted. And of course, industrial activities also continued. And due to the combination of all these events, the situation once again became severe by 1957, when there was no established fish population between Kew and Gravesend. And this was when the Thames was declared biologically dead. The Thames Survey Committee was then asked to investigate the reasons behind this dire state of the Thames. And their investigation showed that while the water temperature went up by about 3 degrees Celsius, the levels of dissolved oxygen had dropped, which significantly affected the Thames fauna. And this is because there is a negative correlation between dissolved oxygen and temperature. So when the water temperature increases, the dissolved oxygen levels will drop. And in addition to all those excess pollution, power stations also contributed to the problem. When it comes to the functioning of power stations, they take on water to cool their equipment, and that heavily heated water then gets discharged back into the river or the ocean, wherever they may be. And so the same was happening in the Thames as well. Later, the P-Part Committee examined the findings of the Thames Survey Committee, and they basically established that the estuary should support benthic fauna and migratory fish species as well. So there was a large investment made into the sewage treatment works, and the waste disposal methods also improved, and some of the power stations also closed down. And in the subsequent years, in fact, only within a couple of years, there was a return of fish species. Large number of fauna started to recolonize the Thames, and one of the first ones to do that was the flounder and the European eel. And this takes us to the present. So first of all, about the habitats in the Thames estuary. Today, the main type of intertidal habitats are salt marshes, seagrass meadows, and mudflats. Mudflats are actually very rich with life. This is where most of the invertebrate species can be found, which are, of course, a great food source for both birds and fish. And in terms of fish and the cumulative number of fish species found in the Thames, since its recovery, the number is at 125 species. And of course, these include the European eel, flounder, the sea bass, Dover sole, smelt, and so on. In terms of the distribution of these fish species, their presence will largely depend on the weather and the season, of course, and how much they actually tolerate fresh water, brackish, and salty water. So, for example, during periods of increased precipitation, the freshwater zone can be slightly pushed further downstream. And during periods of drought, the salty water can penetrate further upstream as well. I've mentioned mud before and the reasons why the Thames is brown. So mud is actually somewhat of a magic ingredient in all this, because it carries both organic and inorganic matter, which makes the estuary a very productive system. And because of all those intertidal habitats that I've mentioned before, and because of this magic mud, the Thames is actually a very important nursery area. It is one of the only 5 known nursery grounds for Dover sole in the UK, and it is now the largest sea bass nursery in southern England. There are also 7 species of fish believed to be spawning in the Thames. These are the roach, the perch, and the bream, upstream from the Richmond half tideway, the common dace, and the European smelt, somewhere around the mouth of the River Wanda, the sand smelt, somewhere around Greenwich, and the common goby around Canvey Island. Because of the connection to the sea, there are, of course, sharks in the Thames, and just 3 examples. The taupe, the starry smoothhound, and the dogfish. And these species are actually, they can be found further out in the outer part of the estuary. They feed on small fish and invertebrates, and of course, they are a very important part of the overall Thames ecosystem, so they shouldn't be feared at all. There are also mammals. There are the combined number of population of harbor seal and grey seal. The number of individuals is about 4,000 in the Thames. In terms of distinguishing harbor seal and grey seal, harbor seals will be a little bit smaller, and they have more like a cat-shaped face, and grey seals will have a bit more of a dog-shaped one. And there are, of course, harbor porpoises as well. Just going back to intertidal habitats and their importance. So apart from them acting as a very important nursery ground for fish, they also provide important ecosystem services for us, such as food provision, coastal protection. They enhance biodiversity, and of course, they play an important part in climate regulation as well. However, as we slowly built up the foreshore, large areas of these intertidal habitats were lost, and with that, these important ecosystem services too. Today, only about 1% of the Thames bank remain natural in profile. This is about a 1.3 kilometer long stretch at Syon Park. In fact, this is one of the most beautiful parts of the estuary. To counteract this intertidal habitat loss, some of the riverside developments are now set back, and vegetated areas were created to enhance aquatic biodiversity. Some of these are collectively called estuary edges, and these are some of the sites that we manage under the Estuary Edges project. And we annually carry out fish surveys at these sites to show their functioning. And in fact, we have evidence now that these sites are functioning very well for juvenile fish, such as common goby, sea bass, and the European eel. And just another interesting thing about mud. So mud doesn't hold any oxygen, which means that whatever buries in it will be preserved. So objects like parts of clay pipes, Roman roof tiles, pieces of a beer mug, or occasionally even a 5,000-year-old human bone can be found on the foreshore. And over time, as these objects were found, this actually helped piece together London's history. And moving on to the future of the Thames. So because of the Basel jet sewer system is a combined system that actually collects both road runoff and household waste, And because the system was built for 4 million people, whereas now there are 9 million living in London, during times of heavy rain, the system overflows into the Thames. And to remedy this, the Tideway tunnel, or the London super sewer, is currently being built, and this is expected to come online in 2025. This is designed to capture any sewage overflow and to store it up to 18 hours, and of course gradually feed it to the treatment works. And once it becomes operational, then sewage discharge from that old Victorian system should decrease by 90%. With the building of this super sewer, open public spaces are also being created by the river, and some of these will also have vegetation which will serve as an aquatic habitat. Moving on to climate change and the climate emergency. So data collected from around the globe now show that in the last 200 years, atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased by more than 50%. And with that, the average global temperature by about 1 degree Celsius. We can see the same increasing trend in temperatures in the UK as well. And of course, this is also affecting the Thames Estuary, where we can see an increasing water temperature, both in the upper tidal Thames area and the the middle tidal Thames area. Similarly, there's an increasing trend in sea level, which is about 4 millimeters per year, although in the last 30 years or so, this accelerated slightly. Unfortunately, even if emission would stop now, we would still be locked in an irreversible climate change for the next century. And projections show that the London area is particularly vulnerable for flooding, overheating, and drought. The projections also show that by 2050, London could see an increase in mean summer temperature of 2.7 degrees Celsius, with some extreme weather events observed as well during the summer period, such as less frequent but more intense rainfall, and then extended periods of drought as well. And the same applies for the winter season, when we can see increasing number of winter storms as well as heavy rain events. In fact, this is something that we're already seeing, and it was in 2015 when the naming system for the storms had to be introduced to be able to distinguish them. One of the reasons why these heavy rainfall events will occur is because for every degree of warming, water vapor content of the atmosphere will increase by 7%. So the intensity of the downpours will also increase. And in terms of extreme weather patterns or weather events, when we see days of very warm and very cold weather, that is due to the changing pattern of the jet stream. So under normal circumstances, the jet stream would stay in place thanks to the pressure differences between the high and the low latitudes. But as the Arctic warms, this pressure difference reduces and the jet stream becomes wavier, bringing in either very warm air from the south or very cold air from the north. Again, in terms of the projections, so sea level is set to rise further. And in the Thames area, we are already locked in for an at least 1 meter rise by the end of this century. In addition to this, southern England is slightly sinking by about 2 millimeters per year. due to the isostatic rebound following the last ice age. So you can see on this map that as that ice sheet went away, the northern part of the British Isles is rising up, whilst the southern part is sinking. And of course, with the more intense downpours and the sea level rise, a large part of London is under the threat of flooding, and the prevention of flooding is one of the most important tasks set out by the Thames Estuary 2100 plan. In terms of solutions and to try to deal with the effects of climate change, there are two ways in which measures can be put in place. One is adaptation, where we prepare and cope with the change. And in this example shows preparing for sea level rise. So flood defenses, whether that be river walls along the estuary or barriers or gates, these are being put in place. These are being maintained and also being repaired. Another way to try to deal with climate change is mitigation, where we help to minimize the effects of climate change. And one example for this is the creation of sustainable drainage systems, or SUDs, when we basically create more green patches to soak up any excess water. And of course, by introducing more SUD systems, putting in more vegetation, we can also deal with the urban heat island effect. And another way of mitigation is, where possible, in the estuary, to create and restore habitats. And again, an example for that are these estuary edge sites, which can provide habitat and also slightly reduce, perhaps even protect the river wall behind it. And from this issue of flooding and how we will cope with the climate emergency, I will hand it over to Amy now.
Thanks, Wanda. So I'm going to be concentrating on a project that we have in-house that kicked off early this year in the summer, but was in development for a very long time over the last 3 or 4 years. It's called the Joint Thames Strategies Refresh Project, and it's looking at how we can bridge the land-sea interface through planning policy and riverside development to ensure that those T2100 recommendations can get embedded and delivered through local authority, local plans, essentially making it a lot easier to actually not just tackle the flood defence needs all along the tidal Thames, but also to bring in those wider benefits that can be delivered at the same time, such as habitat enhancement, reconnecting the different intertidal habitats across the whole estuary. So really looking at this as a whole system, not just piece by piece within our administrative boundaries that the estuary and the ocean really don't give two figs about. So can you go on to the next slide, please, Wanda? So the Joint Thames strategies are actually existing pieces of supplementary planning guidance that sit within the overarching planning guidance for London, called the London Plan. Now, the London Plan doesn't dictate to London boroughs. It strongly recommends different approaches and provides different strategies within it, increasingly more integrated between each other. So, for example, they have an environment strategy that is closely linked with things like the transport strategy, for example. Used to have a standalone River Thames policy within it, but now the River Thames is actually integrated across all the different strategies within the London Plan, which is really good progress. Last time it was reviewed. Those 3 existing supplementary pieces of planning guidance called Joint Thames strategies runs between Wadebridge to Kew, so that's in the west end of the Tideway, and then you can see it highlighted in orange. Can you flip back to the previous slide? Sorry, not the previous slide, this one. Then we have straight after that, so from Kew to Chelsea, there's another Joint Thames strategy, and that's in light blue that you can see highlighted there just after the orange. back again. And then the third joint Thames strategy is Thames Strategy East. This is the one that Thames Estuary Partnership project managed between 2005 and 2008 when it was published. And that's the big light green section you can see there along the middle. What you can see from this map is that there is no joint Thames strategy sitting between Chelsea and Tower Bridge. And there is no joint Thames strategy below the Thames Strategy East area, which actually goes beyond the Greater London Authority area, which is the area covered by the London Plan. So these joint Thames strategies are basically a way to provide planning guidance and planning advice to local authorities for their riverside, but not just within their borough. It covers what we call characteristic reaches of the Thames. So it takes account the south bank and the north bank and the water in between. And it covers off, which I'll get to in a later slide, various different elements that you should be taking into account when you're designing and planning along the riverside for development. So next slide, please, Wanda. Sorry, just flip back again. Sorry about that. Forgot to mention that T2100, what you can see here in the dark blue underlaid under the joint Thames strategies is the T2100 policy areas. So the way T2100 is unfolding is it's a 100-year blueprint from the time of publication through to 2021, or just past. And it's being reviewed in 10-year segments. So they've just undergone the first 10 years, where an assessment has been made on all the flood defences along the tidal Thames, and that 10-year review is now culminated in specific recommendations on a reach-by-reach basis. And a reach along the Thames is actually quite a small area, and there'll be many reaches within a riverside borough's boundary. What this takes into account is obviously not just, it is primarily focused on tidal surge flooding, but it does take account of pluvial and fluvial flooding coming from up catchment. So it's not just about our hardline flood defences along the river walls and the barrages, barriers that we have to either get in place or maintain over the next 90 years. It also takes account of that extreme weather that Wanda touched on before, and predictions for how fluvial and pluvial flooding is going to affect and interact with tidal surges. So it's really much all about how those three things come together in a perfect storm, if you like, to make us truly climate resilient into the future. And T2100 is taking what's called an adaptation pathways approach. So what this means is that constantly and continuously throughout that time, they're monitoring the climate science and they're adjusting the predictions. So every 10 years, those recommendations could actually change. And we've seen that just in this last 10-year recommendation alone, which was published earlier this year. The timelines, and they're recommending through that adaptation pathways that each London borough take a riverside strategy approach. So that means they want to see each riverside borough have a riverside strategy for flood defence and those wider benefits embedded in their local plan by 2030 to match the net zero targets of the Environment Agency and the net zero targets of the government. So it seemed like a prime opportunity for us to get the joint Thames strategies refreshed. This is partly because even though they're supplementary planning guidance embedded in the London Plan, they are not statutory. They should be taken account of, but there's no monitoring. There is no legal requirement to meet the recommendations within those riverside strategies. And also similarly, T2100 is not a statutory piece of work either. So in order to try and get that firmer lever for planners, for London boroughs who are the landowners and have responsibility for this approach, there needs to be some sort of legislative hook that really gets this delivered without having to negotiate, advocate, taking all the time of the different regulatory agencies and third-party organisations like the Thames Estuary Partnership to get this good practice approach embedded in the way things are done. And this was really the trigger for us taking forward this joint Thames Strategies Refresh project, which is fully supported by the EA's T2100 team and the operational team confusingly called Team 2100, which stands for Thames Estuary Asset Management. Right, enough about T2100, onto the JTS project. I'll say JTS as the Joint Thames Strategy. So I'm going to focus in on Thames strategies, because this is the area that Thames Estuary Partnership is going to be leading on. We are working in partnership with Thames Landscape Strategy, which holds the Weybridge to Kew strategy, coordinates and monitors it. And then Thames Strategy Kew to Chelsea has a part-time coordinator embedded in Hammersmith and Fulham. The lead partner on the project is Richmond, the London Borough of Richmond upon Thames. And we're working very much in collaboration across the whole tidal estuary. I just wanted to say that. But Thames Estuary Partnership is focusing on scoping out the gaps in the middle, the central section between Kew to Chelsea with the City of London Corporation and the Riverside boroughs there. And then we're also looking at the coastal stretch with Essex and Kent County Council. But I'm going to focus in on Thames Strategies, because this is one of the existing Joint Thames Strategies, and it has not been reviewed, it has not been refreshed since 2008, and it is a 100-year planning document, which seems kind of crazy in the way that our planning system works and the short-term changes in our political administrations as well. But there we go. It's a 100-year planning document. So here you can see the area that we're talking about. We have the strategy area running through the middle. So that's the riverside extent of all of those boroughs that you can see there, of which there were 11 involved in the original Joint Thames Strategy project. Next slide, please. And the purpose of the strategy was really to bring a holistic and long-term vision and framework for the sustainable future development management of the strategy area, that characteristic reach of the Thames Estuary over the next 100 years. It's a cross-borough, cross-river perspective to inform the preparation of regional spatial strategies, local development frameworks, master plans, design guidance, and investment programmes and priorities. Next slide. The vision for the Thames strategy is to achieve a world-class river where diverse social, economic, cultural, and environmental legacy is recognised through conserving and enhancing the natural assets of the area, balancing the competing demands, creating vibrant and sustainable communities alongside the Thames that benefit new and existing residents, creating a high-quality, multifunctional, well-connected network of river-related spaces within that area that are managed and maintained for the highest standards for people and wildlife, and promoting the use of the river as an artery for public, commercial, industrial, leisure, and recreational transport and use. There's no pressure there. Next slide. And this all started with a character assessment. So really looking at that characteristic stretch, providing, honing down on a broad summary of the river in terms of its landscape, its townscape, its riverscape, and a baseline for this strategic guidance. And then a suite of strategic guidance statements that really were grouped together under some specific priorities and recommendations of core principles and the key policy context for each of these for riverside development within the area. And these covered off quite a few elements: planning and development, biodiversity, archaeology and the built environment, historical assets, cultural resources, flood risk management, and the economy of the River Thames corridor. Then it boils down into reach-specific guidance, where it gets really technical. It provides detailed priorities and recommendations for the framework plans, design guidance and policies within 9 characteristic reaches of the Thames Strategy area. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the refresh, as I touched on, is reviewing the existing Joint Thames Strategy alongside the other existing Joint Thames Strategies and scoping out creation of a Joint Thames Strategy where there's none currently there. And this will include character assessments and a review of the character assessment and the legislative changes that have taken place since its publication in 2008, of which there are many. And then really honing in on that strategic and the reach-specific guidance. So the idea being that each of the riverside boroughs, they've been tasked with creating their own riverside strategy, but because they sit within a characteristic area, they're going to have shared issues and challenges within that characteristic area, but also across the whole tidal Thames as a system. So we're setting up multiple layers of governance, if you like, and oversight, strategic advice within the project to really get the scale, the different scales of collaboration and consideration that we need to be taking account of, not just within the joint Thames strategies, but to deliver against the T2100 recommendations. So the primary aim is for each borough to help deliver the T2100 recommendations, and for each borough to work together within the area to embed those recommendations in there without having to fund and create individual riverside strategies, and really ensuring that coordination across our administrative boundaries within that characteristic stretch. All the Thames councils are facing the same challenge, adapting the riverside in response to the impacts of climate change, particularly from the risk associated with sea level rise, but also from that upcatchment risk from pluvial and fluvial flooding. If you look at some of those flood risk maps, you'll see that the Thames riverside is actually a major flood risk from those as well. So we need to be innovating around green infrastructure and how that's built along the Thames path, interacting with the river via our flood defence, if at all possible. Next slide, please. The requirements, this infographics taken from the T2100 10-year recommendations, and it just drills into the requirements for a riverside strategy. So flood defences raised to the recommended height by the deadline and providing resilience against future flood risk. Development, wherever possible, is set back from the river, providing space for maintenance, future defence raising, but also enabling enhancement of the public realm and making space for those intertidal habitats, such as estuary edges. Identifying and securing the land needed for future flood defence upgrades, and have secured it, so be able to so it'll be available when it's required. So this is really looking at where local authorities can purchase land that they will need for flood risk mitigation and adaptation. Making sure that local communities are aware of the importance of adapting to rising sea levels and help shape the versions of their future riverside. So we're really taking that one to heart, and part of the Refresh project itself will be to design and deliver a fully inclusive and participative process to bring in the community voice into those riverside, into the joint Thames strategies, and resulting in the individual riverside strategies. So it's really having them take ownership, not just of their own riverside, but also the changes they can expect to see over time. That flood defences are designed holistically and innovatively to avoid negatively impacting development behind them, and that new intertidal habitat is created along our tidal riverside, as well as any additional natural capital. Riversides are more accessible for local communities and river users, but in particular continuous Thames path. So it's a real opportunity to get that joined up and in the public realm, rather than within private ownership, which there are sections that are still privately owned. And tidal riverside supports sustainable growth and provide enhanced social, cultural and commercial benefits. So you can see they're really, really going to town on the wider benefits. We want to make sure, they and us want to make sure that any flood defence, adaptation and mitigation is delivered with as many wider benefits as possible while we're doing it. Next slide, please. But early planning is key to maximising these wider benefits and the significant public realm improvements. There is going to be a huge amount of public realm change along the riverside, because where flood defences have to be raised by up to 1 metre in some places, that is going to require raising essentially the public realm behind it, so that people can still see over the wall essentially. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity to enhance the public realm and get those green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, habitat enhancement, as well as access, cultural, all those things that really connect us to nature better in an urban setting. And so this is why we're starting now with the Joint Thames Strategy Refresh project. We're in a process. Year one is all about building the business case and taking the local authorities in particular and our key stakeholders along with us, building all of their needs into our plans, and then we'll be recruiting consultants to do both the legislative review and the full legislative and legal review of each of the existing joint Thames strategies, but not just from within the strategies, but the broader framework of policy, like the national planning policy framework and any other policies that come to bear. So things like, obviously, net zero is going to be a big one, but also things like levelling up. So where can we really take some of those principles of levelling up and apply them to the riverside communities? and riverside spaces along the Thames, because we have a huge amount of deprivation and deprived communities, certainly along the riverside. Most of London's most deprived communities are along the Thames. So they have a lot in common with our coastal communities around the UK, and we'll be bringing that socio-economic policy landscape into these joint Thames strategies as much as the planning and the environmental policies as well. So we're in the early planning stages, and then the refresh process will be kicking off from summer next year, pending successful outcome of the business case. Next slide, please. And further benefits, it means that we can positively embrace change, and we can take the communities and the businesses along with us that may traditionally not even think about the river. We can be turning this challenge into an opportunity, raising awareness and attracting that participation. So we're seeing these as an active handbook, not just for the local authorities, but for everybody to be able to utilise in whatever way they need. We're bridging that strategy gap, so creating a framework for strategy adoption into local plans, but also we're bridging the gap between current planning policy and strategy and frameworks with the maintenance and management of the river itself. We're concentrating, which is a real missing piece of the puzzle, that land-sea interface along our estuaries and our coastlines. It's like the gap in the middle. It's bridging the gap in the overlap, as some of my coastal colleagues would say, and really trying to account for our impact beyond just the high intertidal mark, high water mark, which is traditionally where marine policies go to, and land policies go to the low water mark. So our coast is not just that intertidal stretch. We have a massive amount of impact on our waterways from much further upstream inland than our frameworks and our policies currently account for. And our marine environment impacts us both negatively through such example as these sea level rise challenges, but also positive impacts. So really, really trying to drill down into what are the positive benefits that the river brings to us, those ecosystem services, like cooling effects, like oxygen production, like food security through our fish stocks, etc., and all requiring good water quality. So we're really going to bring all of those ecosystem service benefits that the Thames Estuary gives to us and the ocean gives to us. Concentrating and prioritising efforts, so really unlocking that potential in funding and also delivery. And proactively responding to climate impacts, so not waiting until it's too late, and really taking these recommendations seriously, being able to adapt through the adaptation pathway approach. And obviously aligning with the TE 2100 plan, which is acting as a route map towards the riverside strategies and integrating across the land and seascape. Next slide, please. So as I said, this year one, we're developing the business case. It's all funded through the Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. We have a 4-year proposal in there that has essentially been signed off, but the years 2 to 4 funding won't be triggered until the business case is delivered at the end of year 1. So we're contracting consultants to do the review, the joint Thames strategy status analysis, and the legislation update, and taking account of any new policies and that wider policy framework. But also we'll be tendering out essentially a design competition for consultants to design an inclusive participatory refresh process, and the winning tender will actually win the contract and deliver it with us. So we're very much going to be working closely with those consultants, ensuring that this goes according to plan and that we're being inclusive and really bringing in all those different scales of engagement and consultation that I touched on before. We're going through, we've had a first round of engagement with local authorities. There's a lot of support for this because local authorities, as you know, probably are under a hell of a lot of pressure. They have a lot of priorities to deliver with ever shrinking resources. So having someone come along and say, hey, we're going to help you develop your riverside strategy, and you don't have to pay for it, but you do have to give your time and your data. So they're very pleased, most of them. And a lot of them have only just started thinking about their riverside strategy. So we're going to be going through a second round of engagement with them to look at the borough-specific needs and the cross-border opportunities to really hone the business case. And then scoping out the joint Thames strategies refresh through developing that brief for the tender process. So identifying the key outcomes and benefits, the major deliverables and outputs, engagement planning and scheduling. So this is all part of the project initiation documents and the business case development. And then from years 2 to 3, we have the refresh process itself. And then year 4 will be all about bringing it together, developing our digital platform to be the gateway for the joint term strategies moving forward, and then really looking at that long-term governance and iterative refresh process. So since we're collaborating between partners across the whole of the tidal Thames, we want to set up governance arrangements to really make sure that we collaborate into the future and embed a refresh process alongside probably the T2100 recommendations. But that's all in development and very much up for discussion in the future. Next slide, please.
So
thank you, Wanda. I'll hand over to Wanda.
Thank you. So just to finish it up, really, if you want to know more about the Thames and the Thames Estuary, we created a story map during the pandemic, and it's still out there and it's still very popular. So you can have a look through that. And also there are a number of books which I would personally recommend if you want to know more about the Thames. These are of course just some of the starters. And they really take you through the history and how the ecology and the natural history changed over time. And of course, it was published 2 years ago, but the State of the Thames report is very much relevant in terms of if you want to find out more about the current state and what else the future will bring other than the things that I've explained. And lastly, we developed a course which is endorsed by the IES. It's called Introduction to the Thames Estuary. It's a CPD course that can be taken online. I lead on this. It takes about 7 hours. It would be delivered throughout 3 or 4 days or evenings. So if you're interested to attend this one, please just look for it on Eventbrite or just get in touch and I can send you the link. So that's it from us. Thank you very much for the attention. And of course, we are more than happy to answer any questions now.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, both. Yeah, that was a really interesting webinar. I feel like there's just so much that's been covered. So yeah, thank you both for sharing all of those amazing insights. So we have had some questions come through to the Q&A, so I will get started with asking those. And yeah, if anybody else does have more questions, then please do put them into the Q&A box as well. So somebody's asked, how much understanding is there currently about how different the public realm will need to look and feel in future to make places resilient?
I think
I can answer that one.
Yes.
So yes, there's not a huge amount of understanding because it's all in development now. So as I said, the T2100 recommendations only came out earlier this year, where the granularity of how each section of the river wall and each reach is going to need to change. And it's really variable. I did a walk with the City of London a few weeks ago, where they took me along their patch and showcased how literally within, not very good at distances, but let's say within a 5-minute walk from where their area starts at the edge of Tower Hamlets, which is just by the Tower of London, just above Tower Bridge. They have to raise defences in one section by 1 metre, by 1 centimetre in one, like the next section, and then 30 centimetres in the next section. So it's really variable and how they're going to tackle that, because land ownership is very complex as well along the riverside. So you can't assume that the local authority actually owns all the bit of the landward side of the riverside. And actually the flood defence isn't always owned by the Environment Agency either. So there's a very complex piece of governance and land ownership mapping that needs to be done, and that's underway now. T2100 are actually investigating that, as are the Greater London Authority and each of the local authorities themselves, really looking at where they own what. Haven't really answered your question, but they are talking about essentially what can be done if we're going to have to dig up this bit of public realm, or we're going to have to raise the wall significantly, or even put in a bridge across one of the tidal tributaries, for example. How can the public realm be enhanced in the most holistic way possible? So that's the only thing I could say at this point, Alan, but I hope that answers your question in some part. Watch this space.
Oh, thank you, Amy. Yeah, no, that's really really fascinating to hear that it's going to be such variation. So yeah, thank you. Okay, so next question we have then. So is there any plan to give up parts of the riverside to go back to nature, as is happening in some coastal areas where land is being abandoned to go back to salt marsh or mud flats, etc.?
Only where there is space. So I can pretty much say that's not going to happen in the central part of the Thames, obviously, because it's very built up and very narrow. Has a huge amount of heritage protection. So most of where areas are being allowed to flood is in the top ends in Richmond upon Thames, where they've been reconnecting the floodplain there for a very long time, and has been very successful in doing so. So wherever possible, they've reinstated backwater channels. They've got wet woodlands, which is one of the only examples in the UK on an urban estuary. And then downstream, outside of the more built up and urbanised areas, so in the Greater Thames and in the Greater Thames marshes is the only areas that really have any chance of being managed realigned. So I know that there are discussions underway, and we're actually working with the Zoological Society of London on their Transforming the Thames project, which just kicked off this year, and the Environment Agency on their Restoring Meadows, Marsh and Reef project. So we're working collaboratively to do some opportunity mapping around habitat restoration potential in the lower and Greater Thames Estuary. And that's something that's happening all over the country by coastal and estuary partnerships at the moment. So we're hoping to make that space for nature, but crucially, in somewhere like the Thames Estuary, we have to be bringing in those urban interventions to look at that connectivity across the whole system. So it's all well and good making, it's great to be able to make that space, but we really need to be bringing those stepping stones of habitat into the urban bit to link with the floodplain restoration upstream and the salt marsh and the managed realignment restoration downstream.
Oh, great.
So in
Okay.
short, yes, there are plans, but they're not firm.
Yeah, brilliant. No, but it's really good to get insights into all the work that's going on, yeah, to kind of get to that point. So yeah, thank you very much, Amy. Okay, I can see someone's got their hand raised as well. So I don't know if they have a question they'd like to ask verbally. Maybe like if you could type in the chat if you want to ask a question verbally, and then we can get to that. But I'll ask the ones that we've got in the Q&A for now. So someone has asked, the elephant in the room for all environmental development issues is population growth. In this instance, its impact on increasing sewage and declining river quality downstream from the Dockland sewage works. What are the targets for water quality in the downstream Thames and the quality of the treatment processes from both the massive sewage works and various industrial effluents? Who'd like to take one?
Tricky one, Amy.
No, okay. Short answer is I don't actually know what the targets are for water quality in the downstream Thames. The Tideway, obviously Tideway Tunnel is going to be a major improvement for water quality, providing essentially a storage tank under the Thames for the combined overflow from surface water, domestic sewage. Obviously, sewage has been in the news a lot recently, and I know that we have 3 water industry companies across the Thames Estuary. So Thames Water, Southern Water and Anglian Water. Thames Water is it's a bit of a weird sort of Tetris jigsaw puzzle when you get to Southend, where Anglian, I think, is most of the inland, but Thames Water have a thin sliver of responsibility along the riverside. So any long, I don't think there's any long outfalls along that before you get to Southend. But essentially, the lowest treatment works for the Tideway tunnel is Barking, and therefore anything below that is what I don't actually know. So that's where we are planning to talk to Southern as well as Thames Water about that. But there's going to be a lot of input coming from the rivers and the tributaries, obviously coming off the land and the landscape and into the river. So the Tideway tunnel is not going to capture everything. And I think realistically, there's a massive amount of upgrade works that needs to happen, not just for the Thames, but across the whole country, where we have an old system that needs upgrading, but that's going to cost an awful lot of money. Watch this space. I think we can come back and investigate and let you know in an email.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, both your emails are up on the screen, so I guess if people did want to get in touch.
Just to say though that the water quality targets are actually still tied to the Water Framework Directive. So all of the classifications, if you fancy a bedtime read, go into the classifications for water quality along the Thames, and they are actually in there.
Great, thank you. And someone's just put a comment on that question as well.
Yeah, send an EIR to the Environment Agency to be able to give you a full picture.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Okay, so this is the last question for the moment. So if anyone has got more, then as I say, please do put them into the Q&A. So someone's asked, what is the future of the Thames barrier, what with sea level rise? Re-engineering?
Actually, no, a new Thames barrier. We have to build a new one further downstream, but the specific location hasn't been decided upon yet. So quite a lot of variables that have to go into that. So yeah, all of that discussion's underway, and I honestly don't know when they're going to make the decision, but I know it has to be built probably. I think it came forward. I think it's 2050. It used to be 2070. Because the existing Thames barrier is actually coming to the end of its expected life, if you like. So there's probably going to be maintenance and re-engineering whether the two would operate in concert with each other.
Okay, brilliant to know. Thank you. So there's somebody with a hand raised, and I'm not sure if that means they'd like to ask a question verbally. So I'm gonna try that out. So, oh, no, unraised hand. Oh no, the hand's raised again. Okay, I will allow you to talk, and yeah, hopefully you can ask a question. I think you may just need to unmute. See if this can work. Okay, so I'm not sure whether the technical side of that seems to be working. If it is a question and you're able to put it into the chat, then yeah, please do, and then I'll be able to ask it on your behalf. But yeah, okay. Did anybody else have any other questions? I know people have put some kind of comments here and there in the chat, but I haven't seen any other questions come through to the Q&A as of yet. I had a question for you both, actually. So yeah, thinking about the work that you're doing on the joint Thames strategy refresh project in terms of working with the 11 different boroughs on it. I wondered if you've kind of got any examples of, you mentioned about kind of ensuring like good communication between all of them to kind of, yeah, be working towards the same goals really. So yeah, if you have any good examples of ways that you've been able to do that or that you're planning to do that, yeah, things that have worked well.
Well, we're at the very beginning, so I can't really answer that. I mean, we've got a long history of stakeholder engagement, and there's principles of stakeholder engagement that are good to follow. Things like take people on a journey with you. Don't just dictate what you think needs to happen. So that's why we took a long time to even see if we could secure the funding. So that's why we're doing it in phases, because we didn't talk to local authorities during that time of putting the proposal together. We did talk via like forums, like there's a Tidal Council's Flood Forum, for example, that I now chair as a result of this project. There's obviously the T2100 team and their operations team that we work very closely on lots of different projects. But we sense checked it and vetted it with T2100 and those council forums just to see if this was had legs. And then it has actually taken us 3 years to secure the funding. So in terms of engagement moving forward, we are doing one-to-one interviews with each of having one-to-one meetings, with each of the councils, but not just with one team member. So we're covering off any flood and coastal risk officers or anyone that's got that within their responsibility, the planning leads, and nature and open spaces people. So yeah, there's generally 3 or 4 officers that you need to talk to at this stage within, and then they're floating up the ladder in terms of getting sign off from decision makers on letters of support or being part of the refresh process. And then it'll really come down to the design of the process, because our capacity in the team is tiny. Like, we have a really big budget, but we have there's an awful lot to do around like project delivery. So we've decided to bring in consultants to actually deliver, do the logistics, do the planning, do all the running around basically, to make sure that we get the engagement right. And each London borough is going to have different types of communities that they have to talk to. So it's not going to be a one size fits all across the whole of the Thames, not just from a challenge and a thematic point of view, but from actually the demographics, the types of communities, the number of businesses versus residents, it goes on and on and on. So that really needs engagement professionals to help guide us. But equally, we have a huge amount of experience in the Thames Landscape Strategy team, who have actually navigated a refresh of their strategy once before on their own. They did it in-house by hook or by crook with no money. So they are extremely engaged, and they are embedded in the local council with their local stakeholders and communities. They're very visible within their communities, and they're very embedded in the local council. They're actually hosted by Richmond Council. So they are a font of knowledge on how to actually do this well and do it efficiently. So they'll be really leading on advising the consultants and making sure that the process works for their kinds of communities. But then we also need consultants that can be a bit more innovative. So we don't just want the usual customers coming to workshops and community meetings. We need to reach the people that don't traditionally engage with this kind of stuff, and enable them to participate in a meaningful way that's not going to make their heads explode or worry them.
Yeah, very true. Great. No, well, it's really good to see. It sounds like you're very much taking a kind of whole systems approach to the project. So yeah, that's great to hear. Something we're definitely big advocates of at the IES. So yeah, thank you for sharing. Okay, so I think I will probably start to wrap it up there. We haven't had any more questions come through. So yeah, I suppose I'd just love to say a massive thank you to both Wanda and Amy for your really fascinating presentation today, and yeah, answering everyone's questions as well. I'm just going to quickly put up the poll again that I had going at the start of the session, just to capture people's thoughts now, see if anything's changed from after listening to the presentation today. And yeah, just to highlight as well that this webinar has been recorded and we'll be making it available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. So do take a look at that if you'd like to watch it back. We should also be able to share the slides as well. I know somebody asked about that. So yeah, I'll pop a link into the chat so you can access our YouTube. And I'd also like to highlight that we are hosting our next event tomorrow as part of the Turning the Tide project. That's a lunchtime, UK lunchtime speed networking event. So yeah, if anybody is interested in joining and getting some time to chat with some other people working in the sector, also across the whole environmental sciences field, then do come along to our networking event. So yeah, that is everything from us today. I hope that everyone that's joined has found it useful, and don't forget that you can log it if you are an IES member as CPD by logging into the members area. So yeah, if you're interested in staying further up to date with our Turning the Tide project, then do sign up to our newsletter if you haven't already. And I will leave it at that. Just a massive thank you again to Wanda and Amy. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.